Our colleges and universities share a commitment to serve as centers of open inquiry where, in their pursuit of truth, faculty, students, and staff are free to exchange ideas and opinions across a full range of viewpoints without fear of retribution, censorship, or deportation.
Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about academic freedom and government interference in academics.
Indeed, Jonathan, that was quite the quote you just read. And, I have to tell you that I am happy that people are standing up for these principles because I think they're the most important principles that we could have. But I also have to tell you that I find it somewhat amusing the way that these principles are now being defended after essentially having abandoned them for 5 years. These 562 university presidents or signatories that are all claiming to stand up for it. I wonder where they were between 2015 and 2021. Where were all these people?
Well, Jules, let's just inform our listeners where that quote comes from. The 562 university presidents signed a statement called A Call for Constructive Engagement, in which they essentially said that universities are special places precisely because of the principles of academic freedom, and as such, the government should have a hands-off role in deciding what universities do. And that quote comes from that statement.
For sure. But of course, you're saying it's just the government that should keep their hands off. But I think the quote has much wider implications, right? It says that every individual faculty member also shouldn't have to worry about its own administration imposing censorship and retribution.
Well, I think their argument was exactly that. Their argument was, look, the government should stay away because we are institutions that allow all opinions. And the government is inherently political and shouldn't be imposing the political opinions on the universities, which, let's agree, Jules, we 100% support. But what's hard for us to understand is why the sudden conversion to this. Really, what has irritated both of us is the intense hypocrisy in the stand. Let me give you an example. The chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, as you know, I used to be a professor there, signed the statement, even though until very recently at the University of California, in order to be hired or get a pay raise, you first had to sign a diversity statement that was then judged. And if it was not judged to be sufficiently committed to the cause, you weren't eligible for either being hired or a pay increase. And included in that, explicitly on the website, it said you were not allowed to argue in your diversity statement that diversity was unnecessary.
I think that it was even worse, Jonathan. I think that if you argued in your diversity statement that you supported Martin Luther King's stance, that the content of your character was more important than the color of your skin and that you therefore should be colorblind, I think that alone was enough to get you disqualified. Because a large group of faculty members and people on that side had come to the conclusion that colorblindness was racist.
And I mean, for the chancellor of Berkeley to now turn around and tell the administration that he should be free of any interference because he upholds academic freedom and his faculty can have a full range of viewpoints without fear of retribution, censorship, or deportation. Well, I tell you what, not getting a pay increase in most people's mind would be retribution.
No, and if you want to talk about places that have retribution, we only have to look to the place where I work, which is at the University of Pennsylvania.
And your president signed it.
Yes, our former interim president, now president, has decided to sign this at a time that the university in no way has retracted its persecution of Amy Wax, a professor at the law school, who definitely has said things that would make most people's blood boil at a university. But if we have to take these presidents' word for it, a full range of opinions was entirely allowed without fear of retribution. Or maybe her opinions don't include the full range. The full range seems to me like the full range, Jonathan. I don't think that there's anything that can be negotiated there.
Well, what's ironic about this is this statement, in my opinion, makes the Trump administration's position on universities stronger, not weaker, right? Because up to now, it has been very clear what a full range of opinions meant. A full range of opinions meant left-wing opinions. It did not mean right-wing opinions. And so the Trump administration telling the universities that they were not places where all opinions were allowed, for the universities to turn around now and say, oh, no, we're the citadel of that, it makes it obvious how hypocritical they are and how they can't look after their own ships. The Trump administration's view is the universities can't do it, we have to intervene.
Oh, you're so right about Jonathan. I always have to think about that joke that Steven Pinker told, where he said, like, when you're at the North Pole, it doesn't matter in what direction you walk, you automatically walk south. And the university campus had become the left pole. No matter what direction you walked into, it would be more right-wing than where you were. And so I think you're completely right. The full range of opinion wasn't really the full range of opinion. And that made the universities vulnerable. But I think indeed that the way to become immune to the criticism is not to now pretend that none of this ever happened. I think it's important to come clean about what the problems were before, propose specific measures to resolve these problems, make sure that the university does incorporate all opinions and is open to them, and then you can take a stance like the one that we're seeing here. But I think that most universities right now are in no position to take this stance, honestly.
I think this is the source of the problem. And it's going to be very difficult for universities to convincingly commit to true academic freedom. But at the same time, I think that that's really the only way a university can survive. I do not think a university that's subject to government interference can be effective. And Trump is right to point out that the problems are, but burning the whole system down isn't the solution. And I don't really know how universities can credibly commit to fix the problem.
But the glass half full approach, I think, is maybe in order, Jonathan. Maybe there is some hope here. We need to stay optimistic. Or otherwise, what solutions can we come up with to fix this problem? Clearly, the way that the Trump administration is approaching it is not a way that we would do it. On the other hand, I think it's also true that there's a large group of centrists that now for over a decade, with a gradualist approach, has tried to improve things with some success, but definitely overall, I think the success has been little. So what is the solution?
I think, Jules, the solution to the problem has to start with social norms. Even if you have very strong policies, people have to feel that it's important to the mission to disagree. And then when somebody disagrees, it is bad behavior to socially ostracize.
For sure.
And that is the essential. If we can do that, we can fix the problem. You know, when you say this, I'm going to make a proposal to my institution at Stanford for a day at freshman week where we talk to the freshmen and we model the behavior of considering all opinions. Now, obviously, one day is not going to make a huge difference, but I will say this, that when the freshmen come in, they are highly impressionable. And making this a top priority during freshman week, I think sends a very clear message. So I'm hopeful that the university will think along those lines.
And I agree with you that policies that are not culturally supported will not succeed in any case. But I do think that in the past, there was the culture that defending the principle was more important than winning this one battle and getting this one up. And it seems that that has sort of passed. Everybody just gets the short-term wins. And if the power is on one side, they get the short-term win there. And if the power is on the other side, they get the short-term win there. And nobody is willing to intentionally distance themselves from the power and say, I will give up my power to win this one short-term battle to show that I'm willing to defend the principles. And we're not seeing anybody doing that. And I think that I wish that culture would return.
Yeah. certainly there was a time, maybe it was a short time, where that culture did exist, where playing devil's advocate was respected for the intellectual position and the ability to do it and how smart you were that you were able to do it. And that's gone away. Well, Jules, I think at this point we should introduce our guest. Our guest today is Richard Saller. Richard is an American classicist. He was president of Stanford University on an interim basis last year, and before that he served as provost of the University of Chicago. Speaking as a faculty member at Stanford, Richard did an outstanding job as an interim president, taking over from a university president who had to resign under tenuous circumstances, and then handling the Arab-Israeli protests on campus. And I'm deeply grateful for Richard's leadership during that time. Richard, welcome to the show.
It's great to have you, Richard.
Thank you.
Well, Richard, why don't we start with the question I think is on everybody's minds. Do you think universities have lost their independence?
I think universities have never been completely independent post-World War II. When Vannevar Bush started the program of big-time federal funding for research on university campuses, the government at that point had leverage and left universities with a choice to either follow the government guidelines or to give up the federal funding. And we need to remember that in the 1950s, in the McCarthy era, there was a lot of pressure. My mentor in Cambridge was fired from Rutgers University because of his use of free speech. So I don't think that that's new. During the Vietnam War era, there were controversies between the federal government and the campus about confidentiality or classification of research. So the issues change from decade to decade, but it's not new.
So what do you think about the dependence of universities on federal funds? It seems to me that at this point, universities are quite vulnerable to changes in federal funding. And when we see announcements being made that federal funding is being cut, universities immediately respond. We had a whole episode based on how do endowments really work, and a lot of the endowment capital in perpetuity has already been committed, meaning that as soon as federal funding is being cut, we see that universities immediately change policy. Do you think it's a good thing how dependent universities are on federal funding? Do you think they should strive to become more independent from it? What is your take on this?
I think it's a dilemma that any major research university faces. There's no question but that we would be very badly diminished in our research programs if we didn't have federal funding. I think at Stanford, federal funding supports about $1 billion a year. And so the dilemma is, do we accept federal funding in order to maintain the best research programs in the world, or do we contract our ambitions? My own view is that it's a matter of deciding what the boundaries are. I think when Harvard drew the line and said, we're not going to have you intervening in our academic appointments or curricula, that's a decision that I would have made too if I'd had to face that.
Do you think that the current discussion around federal funding and the use of federal funds to pressure universities to partake in certain research agendas, do you think this is something new, or do you think that really already in the couple of years leading up to the Trump administration, there was already quite a lot more government intervention in the way that universities were being operated? Or do you think that Trump is really a clean break with, say, the decade that came before that?
I think Trump is something different in the extent of the threats, and we don't know how those are going to work out. I think things are still in flux, and it depends on the courts and then whether Trump and his administration will follow the decisions of the courts. I guess what I think is that when the threats to take away funding are within the bounds of the law, then I think that that's acceptable and to be expected. It's when the threats bleed over beyond that, for example, lifting not-for-profit status from the whole university, that I think is unacceptable.
Richard, the extent to which Trump is going against universities, I think, reflects a frustration the rest of America has with our institutions. And I go backwards and forwards with arguing with people about this. My view is this is because of the hypocrisy in the universities, the fact that there's, as much as the universities claim to have academic freedom, in fact, limit quite extensively the kind of discussion on universities, where other people argue, no, that may be part of it, but there are much bigger issues like the fact that we reject so many students and things like that. What's your view on that?
I guess I think it's a matter of the revolt against elitism that we see across the country, a revolt against the very idea of expert knowledge. And I think that that's the basis for universities. So I think it's a broader attitude. Another issue is, we're constantly accused of charging too much in the way of tuition for our students and that we're a wealthy institution. But as you said, Jules, the endowments are tied up in various restricted ways. And so it's not as if we can just draw down the $37 billion balance that we have.
But Richard, on the question of tuition, and we discussed this extensively when we spoke about endowments in an earlier episode, the actual tuition paid by students is a very small fraction of the stated tuition. Now, why is it that that message doesn't seem to get across? I mean, I think it's not because we just don't do it. I think that there's a deeper reason that nobody wants to accept that, in fact, it's cheaper to go to Stanford than it is to go to Berkeley if you are not wealthy.
So, Jonathan, I think that that's part of the broader problem that we have with communications. I think you're exactly right. Tuition doesn't cover the real cost of the education at Stanford. But it's also true that we have a problem in communicating the value of the research that comes out of the university, because the media would much prefer to cover a sensational story about some kind of scandal than they would about the incremental benefits of the biomedical research that we're doing, the other kinds of research that we're doing.
But what I mean by this is, I think it's fair to say that many universities felt as if part of their mission was what I would loosely call social justice, that it wasn't just education and research, but we had a mission to fix the world. And obviously, fixing the world in the sense of a few people's definition of what a fix would be, not necessarily the country's definition of what a fix would be. And so the perception that we were imposing these values on our students, and as experts, we were making the claim that these values were somehow universal, and if you didn't have them, that was either you had nefarious intentions or you just weren't smart enough. To what extent do you think that is playing into our problems?
I think it is, and I agree with you. And I have to say, I was delighted when John Levin, in his inaugural address back in October, said that the university's mission is not social justice. So he was quite explicit about it. And I think the social justice mission contributes to the view that we're not a meritocracy and it's not a level playing field.
What is not a meritocracy? What's not the university or society?
The university is not a meritocracy. And that we feel a mission that goes beyond discovery and education. And in my inaugural, I tried to bring us back to that, to research, education, and clinical care as our missions.
One thing that I'm struggling with a lot in this context is that I also am quite appalled by some of the measures that the Trump administration is imposing. But the response of the universities to this has been to say that there's complete academic freedom on the campus and that the government had no role in interfering with this academic freedom and pursuing all of these scientific topics. But due to the discussion that we were just having, I mean, my experience has been already in the last 5 years that a lot of academic freedom was already not there anymore. For example, at the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Wax has been persecuted purely for her speech. And so for the Penn president to sign a statement that says, we adhere to academic freedom and freedom of expression, and all views on this campus are welcome, and the government has no business suppressing this, I'm almost find it hypocritical and painful to see that these statements are being made. And so I think that particularly for outsiders, when they're looking at this battle, I'm not sure it's clear to them whose side they should pick.
I think that that's right. And I am almost a purist, and maybe a purist on academic freedom and free speech on campus. And the issue that was foremost at Stanford a couple of years ago was the question of condemning Scott Atlas for his views. And I thought the Faculty Senate had no role in putting that to a vote, because I think universities should be about expert knowledge, and most of the senators sitting in that room and voting didn't have expert knowledge about the issues.
What really bothers me is this, and that is that standing up for academic freedom and freedom of expression when that's convenient for the side that you were arguing already anyway is a very easy thing to do. And I think that a lot of the people, present company excluded, by the way, but a lot of the people that I'm currently seeing upstanding for academic freedom, when this other side was misbehaving, they were nowhere to be found in terms of defending the rights of these people. So I think that the true test of somebody who supports academic freedom should be, are you willing to stand up for somebody who says something that makes your blood boil? I think we're seeing very little of that, unfortunately.
I think that that's right. I'm an ancient historian, and I can tell you that hypocrisy isn't a characteristic that's a monopoly of our own times. There's plenty of it around. What I will say is that I think we need to distinguish between issues of law and issues of campus culture. We talked a lot in the administration last year about how to shift campus culture toward the aspiration that you're articulating, Jules. And, we've got programs to do that. I'm not enough of a Pollyanna to believe that they will cure our problem. But right now, John Etchemendy is teaching a course titled Taboo Topics, and they're discussing in this seminar some of the most sensitive issues like IQ and race. Problem is that I think he has an enrollment of 20 students. Figuring out how to get to the whole student body of 17,000 is a different matter. And I think adding requirements is really not very effective. Universities over the past generations have a whole list of efforts at speech codes that have failed. So we can try to change the culture. There's some evidence that we're making some marginal change. I don't know how deep it's going to run.
I very much appreciate that perspective, although let me just add one last thing to that, which is what I've really noticed is that to some extent, the law doesn't really help you very much if the culture isn't willing to support it and stand up for it. And so these debates about what really is the law, but when people violate it, nobody stands up to it anyway and nothing happens. I think the two really are much more entangled and intertwined than people often think.
I think that that's right, although California has the Leonard Law that says that all university campuses have to adhere to First Amendment freedom of speech. And so last year, when we had some really difficult cases, we hired an outside First Amendment specialist to give us judgments so that we didn't get pushed around by the internal politics in the university. Having said that, I mean, we know from centuries of court cases that defining exactly what's protected by the First Amendment isn't crystal clear. And then it's even more murky when it gets to campus culture. And I think that that's right. What constitutes harassment? Well, that's partly in the mind of the beholder. Last year, I couldn't find any bright line to make that judgment.
Agreed.
To what extent do you think university presidents have come clean about this? Don't you think they would put themselves in a far better position if instead of getting on their high horse and claiming that these great institutions protect all kinds of knowledge, instead they went out and said, for the last, whatever it is, 15 years, we have failed in living up to our own standards?
I think that that's right, Jonathan. And in fact, last year, we had a lot of discontented alumni over issues of the culture, the intellectual culture on campus. And we began to change that attitude of the alums by going out and saying the university has made mistakes in the past. And as president, I was challenged again and again by people who said, yes, but your predecessor made statements about all kinds of issues. And I had to say again and again, yeah, but I'm not my predecessor and things have changed. This is partly my Chicago background. We did issue a statement about the university not taking positions on issues that didn't directly affect the mission of the university.
I think the university presidents, instead of signing these highfalutin statements and forming cabals, if instead they just came out and A, admitted there was a problem, and B, thought about some concrete steps they could take to convince people that they were serious about fixing the problem, I think that would go a long way to fixing the problems we have.
You may be right. I don't overestimate the power of any university president to control what goes on in his community or her community. I said in various contexts last year when people challenged me to keep good discipline and order on campus, I said, I couldn't control the behavior of my own two sons. How am I supposed to control the behavior of 17,000 students? The cultural change is difficult. I think it's easier at Stanford, just given the composition of our faculty. It's easier at Stanford than at a place like Harvard. And I'll say last year I was blessed by having a faculty that by and large was not openly divided. There were some differences of views, and it's certainly true that I was asked to make statements on both sides of the war in Gaza and refused to do it. But I think university presidents coming clean about their campuses is a good first step. And I also think that I don't want to draw attention to put our students and their visas in any more danger than they ought to be.
I agree. I mean, you've got to tread so carefully here. You obviously can't have the federal government come and tell you what classes you teach. That's ridiculous. But by the same token, look, they're giving you the money. So they do, in fact, can decide if they want to support some kind of research and another kind of research. And that's entirely in their prerogative. And just we got to accept that fact.
When I was provost of the University of Chicago 20 years ago now, one of the issues we were dealing with the feds was this issue of graduate student visas and national security. And they wanted a sort of blacklist of countries not to allow into our labs. The difference then and now is that I think some of the visas that are being taken away now, at least as reported in the press, some of those are being taken away for completely irrelevant reasons, whereas with the national security, there was a substantial issue there that we needed to recognize. But we had a choice. The provosts of the Ivy Plus had a choice about whether to buy into the government's effort to establish a category of sensitive but not classified. And Bob Brown at MIT provost said we should not do that. We need a clear line between classified and unclassified and keep the classified research off campus and no boundaries on the unclassified on campus.
I mean, these are very tough issues.
Yeah.
You know, Richard, what upsets me most about this is the faculty are abrogating their responsibility as educators, because one of the most important lessons we are supposed to be teaching our students is that it's absolutely fine to be wrong, and it is a mark of distinction by admitting your mistakes. That's the crucial part of education. And the fact that we don't model that behavior, I think, is very sad.
I think that's right. I think another thing, Jonathan, that's related is teaching students, trying to socialize them with resilience rather than a feeling that they should be safe everywhere they go. You know, for years, I have recoiled every time I hear the phrase, you know, we have to give them safe space. I think that it may be true that just the way that children are being raised in this country contribute to that notion of safe space as a kind of entitlement. But I do think it means that they're reluctant to acknowledge and take any kind of criticism for being wrong.
Richard, it's been a very good conversation. I really appreciate your candor. It's refreshing, I must say, to have somebody in your position be so candid.
I'm glad to talk about it. I'm even happier not to have to be making decisions right now.
Thanks for listening to the All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. Also, be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of Stanford University's Graduate School of Business and the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. It is produced by University FM.